The Peter Schiff Show.
So today, Poland became the 21st country to lower interest rates thus far in 2015. The Polish Central Bank lowered its interest rate to a new record low, 1.5%. It was a 50 basis point cut from 2%. You know, it makes me think of, maybe a joke. How many Polish central bankers does it take to reduce interest rates? I don't know the answer to that question. But however many there were on the central bank's committee, they effectively lowered rates to 1.5%. Now, the interesting thing about the rate cut is it comes against the backdrop of a very strong economy. The Polish economy is the strongest it's been in 3 years. In fact, I think GDP growth for the most recent year trailing is 3.1%. So the Polish economy is growing faster than the U.S. economy. The U.S. economy hasn't grown at 3% in a long time. The fastest rate of growth in the Obama administration was 2.5% in 2010. So the Polish economy is currently growing faster than the U.S. economy, yet the Polish Central Bank decided to lower interest rates to 1.5%. Now, why did they do that? Well, it's all because inflation is too low. And I'm reading an article from Bloomberg, which typically writes these type of articles. And one section, the title of the article, in case anybody wants to find it, is Poland's easing may be over after unexpected half-point cut. And there's a section entitled Policy Conundrum, right? This is supposedly the conundrum. And I'll read a little bit from you. It says, the central bank has missed its 2.5% inflation target for more than 2 years, meaning over the last 2 years, inflation has been under 2.5%. Now, what do you mean they missed their target? I mean, their target isn't to have it exactly at 2.5%, right? I mean, it's just 2.5% is the ceiling, right? There's actually a range that the Polish Central Bank basically has, I guess, as ideal, and it's inflation between 1.5% and 2.5%. And so simply being below 2.5% doesn't mean they've missed their target, because they don't need to hit 2.5%. That's supposedly the ceiling, right? So let me finish. They missed their 2.5% target for more than 2 years and has even undershot the lower end of its tolerance range, set at 1.5% for 24 months. So 1.5% is supposedly the lower end of the band that they're aiming for, right? I guess they think the sweet spot of inflation is about 2%, right? And so they're willing to allow it to go as low as 1.5% or as high as 2.5%. And the article says that in many cases, they've actually been below 1.5% for the past 2 years. And then it says price growth dropped below zero in July. Oh my God. They actually had a month where prices were lower than they were a year prior. Obviously not a lot lower, but a little lower. It says here, starting the country's longest stretch of deflation since the Statistics Office started publishing data back in the 1980s, right? And although, this is not a long run. I mean, they talk about they dropped below zero in July. What is that, 1 month? So they had that's their record. That's their longest string of deflation. They had a month, right? Or maybe it counts it's an entire year, right? July to July, right? Where prices were down. But then it says here, Poland's economy expanded 3.1% from a year earlier in the fourth quarter. Well, that's the slowest pace in 2014. So 3.1% for the fourth quarter was actually slower than it's been all year, so it's been stronger than that, right? It also capped the fastest full-year expansion in 3 years, as deflation helped increase disposable incomes and consumer confidence. Duh! I mean, that's the point. Deflation, falling prices, helps increase disposable income, which is what it does, right? When prices come down, consumers can buy more because, people don't have an unlimited amount of money. Unlike central bankers People don't have printing presses in their basements, right? They just can't go print money. Their consumption, right, their purchases is limited by their incomes or their savings. But as prices come down for the things that they want to buy, now they can afford to buy more things. Maybe as prices come down, some things that were unaffordable that you were just going without, now you can buy something that, but for the price decline, you wouldn't have been able to buy. And if the prices are going down for the things that you are buying, well, now you have money left over to buy those things plus some other stuff that you couldn't have bought had the price not gone down because you would spent too much money on buying certain things. Right, just like people are saying that lower gas prices is going to be good for the consumer because it frees up income to buy other things. Well, that's the same thing that happens when any price goes down. And this Bloomberg the guy who wrote this article is acknowledging that fact that falling prices are helping Polish consumers and therefore helping the Polish economy. Right? And it works in reverse. When prices go up, that undermines consumers because now they can't afford to buy as much stuff. Prices have gone up. They have to buy fewer things. They have to cut back. Maybe prices go up and certain things they decide they have to go without them because now they can't afford it, especially if they have to pay more money for things that they need, like food or energy or electricity. And so you have to give up some of your discretionary items. But if the things that you need become cheaper, that frees up purchasing power to buy the things that you want. And that's, a rising standard of living. So the article points out that the Polish economy is being helped by falling prices. Well, if that's the case, why is the central bank panicking, slashing interest rates to 1.5% to try to create more inflation when it's the absence of inflation that is the reason the Polish economy is so strong? Here's the final paragraph in this section. Policymakers were thus confronted with a conundrum. A conundrum. Pray tell, what is that conundrum, right? Belka told reporters on February 4th, right? I guess this is a Polish official. While falling prices help boost consumption, right? They do, right? The opposite of what they're telling us. They're saying if prices are falling, people will stop consuming. That's nonsense, right? The Polish are acknowledging that falling prices are helping boost consumption because they can see that. Consumers are buying more as prices are going down. That's Econ 101, supply and demand. But here's this quote from Belka, right? This guy. Persistent deflation may be detrimental, causing a textbook reaction to deflation. So in other words, he's concerned because even though deflation is helping the economy now, if the inflation persists, it's somehow going to hurt the economy. Why? Well, because that's what's written in the textbooks. Well, you know what? That means you got to throw out those textbooks, those Keynesian textbooks that say that falling prices are bad, because they're not. Here, the governor stressed that Poland had never experienced deflation in its 25 years as a free market economy, and the potential negative consequences can't be ruled out. Well, how do they know there are any negative consequences? They've never experienced it. And in fact, they've got, according to this article, they've got some mild deflation now, yet they have one of the strongest economies in Europe. So where is the evidence that this lack of inflation or deflation is undermining the economy in Poland? In fact, all the evidence suggests that it's helping. In fact, the central bank is acknowledging that lower prices are helping the consumer. They're just afraid that eventually they'll hurt the consumer because that's what the textbooks say. Well, these textbooks are wrong, right? I mean, if falling prices are helping the consumer, how is it suddenly going to start to hurt? At what point do lower prices begin to hurt the consumer? There is no point where they ever hurt, right? This idea is that, well, if consumers think prices are going to go down, they'll stop buying. Well, they're going down now, and it's not stopping consumers from buying. In fact, they're buying more, right? The guy says that falling prices is helping consumer confidence. Well, when is falling prices going to hurt consumer confidence? I mean, when is it too much of a good thing? And the answer is never, right? If a small drop in consumer prices helps consumption, then a bigger drop will help it even more. The more prices drop, the bigger the boost. Right? If prices get cut in half, I can buy twice as much stuff, right? I mean, so the bigger the drop, the better. There is no magical point where a good thing becomes a bad thing. only in some ridiculous Keynesian textbook. So policymakers are observing that there's a good, strong economy and deflation, right, or stable prices, falling prices, and it's working beautifully. But they don't care about what they're experiencing. They just are looking at these textbooks and thinking, well, we know things are good, but according to this textbook, things are going to get bad. So we better do something about it because, we got to believe what's written in these books. And they might as well be relying on a comic book, because this stuff is all fiction, right? It reminds me of, I don't know, the Beverly Hillbillies. I remember, how many of you are old enough to have seen the Beverly Hillbillies? But I remember Jethro Bodine, who was played by, Max Baer Jr., who was the son of the heavyweight boxer, who was very negatively portrayed in that movie Cinderella Man. But in any event, I remember there was a scene where Jethro wanted to go to the moon, and he had basically put some rocket on his back, and he wanted to fly to the moon. And the reason he wanted to go to the moon was because he wanted to meet all the moon maidens. And I think, I don't know, Jed Clampett or somebody, well, how do you know there are moon maidens? And he says, well, I read it in this comic book that there are, women on the moon, and they're really hot, and I want to go up there and I want to be with these moon maidens. And he said, well, would they put it in a comic book if it wasn't true? And, I guess you could say the same thing about these Keynesian textbooks. I mean, they're just like comic books, and deflation being bad, falling prices being bad is as real as Jethro Bodine's moon maidens. It's pure fantasy, and the fact that every central bank around the world, including Poland, right, all these central banks are all unanimous in their belief that falling prices hurts consumers. Why? I don't know. I mean, we can't actually observe it, but we just know it's going to happen. All right. And it's all based on the depression, right? Oh, we had a depression and we had falling prices. Ergo, falling prices must have caused the depression, right? Which is not true. That is false logic. But it seems if you're going to get a job today in any central bank anywhere around the world, you have to flunk a course in basic economics. You have to flunk a course in introductory logic. And you have to have no common sense. So if you meet all three of those criteria, then you can get a job at a central bank. Now, maybe you need to have a college degree, too, in economics, or maybe you have to have a PhD. But you can't know anything about anything, and then you can work at a central bank. Because you have to be a complete fool to believe this. I mean, maybe even more foolish than Jethro thinking there are maidens on the moon, because he only went to the 6th grade, right? And so these guys went through college, they went through their PhDs, and they basically believed the equivalent of hot women on the moon. Now, here's the thing that's interesting, because you have these central banks that all believe that we need more inflation. So according to this Polish central bank, right, they want to keep inflation in this Keynesian sweet spot of 1.5% to 2.5%. So they just want money to lose about 2% of its value every year. They want the cost of living to go up by about 2% per year. And supposedly this is better than the cost of living staying the same or going down, right? It's basically a reduction in your quality of living when your cost of living goes up. But be that as it may, they think that we need inflation between 1.5% and 2.5%. And because it's below 1.5%, they need to really stimulate with the lowest interest rates they've ever had, right? Well, what happens if they succeed in increasing the rate of interest, the rate of inflation, but it goes above 2.5? What happens if it goes to 3 or 3.5? Well, now they're going to have to jack interest rates way up, right? Maybe they'll have to go to 5 or 6%. Who knows what they're going to have to do? But if they're worried when inflation is below 1.5%, they have to be equally worried when inflation rises above 2.5%. You see, it's very difficult to be so precise and fine-tune it to such a small degree. I think I've mentioned this before, but I think it's one of the only analogies or things I think I got out of my Berkeley education. But I remember in econ class, a professor described or used the analogy of a man in a shower to talk about the lag effect. central bankers are trying to target something, let's say like inflation, and they use money supply or interest rates, and they tend to overshoot. Because the analogy is a man in a shower. We've all had this experience. You get into a shower and the water temperature is too cold. And so you turn the dial and it's still too cold. So you turn it a little bit more to the hot and it's still too cold. And you keep turning it until you burn yourself because now the water is scalding hot. And then you try to cool it off and then it becomes too cold. And it takes a while before you get it just right because you keep overshooting to the extremes because there's a lag between turning the faucet and the water changing temperature. And so you turn it quickly and you expect a more immediate response. And so you end up overshooting. And so that is likely to happen with inflation, where you have all these central bankers who are trying to fine tune it. They think the inflation rate is too low. And so they're trying to correct it by turning up the heat, but they're going to overshoot. And now they're going to get an inflation rate that's much too high. And now, they're all going to have to try to bring it down. And this is going to be creating a problem because when prices start to rise faster, that's going to slow down economic growth because rising prices limit consumption because consumers are restrained by prices. If prices go up, they can't afford to buy as much stuff. They have to cut back on the things that they're buying. And so the economy is weakening just as inflation is rising. And now the central banks have to raise interest rates into a weakening economy in order to slow down inflation. So basically, they're sowing the seeds of their own destruction by panicking and thinking the absence of inflation is bad. Now they're going to basically throw gasoline on this fire, make it bigger and bigger, and now they have to try to put it out, and it's going to be very problematic. But where the fire is going to be impossible to put out is in countries like the United States, because Poland can afford to raise interest rates. America can't. There are a lot of countries that can afford higher rates of interest because they don't have the enormity of the debt that we have. They're just recklessly lowering interest rates and undermining their currencies because they bought into this moon-maiden nonsense of low inflation being a bad thing or deflation being a terrible thing. So they've got these rates so low. But when inflation really starts to pick up around the world, then everybody's going to have to start jacking up interest rates to contain it. And that's when you're going to see a huge decline in the dollar because all these other central banks are raising rates and the U.S. is not. And that's going to put even more upward pressure on U.S. inflation. And then what is the U.S. Federal Reserve going to do in response to rising U.S. inflation? Nothing, because they can't do anything, because we have so much debt that we took on to encourage more inflation, that when inflation runs out of control, when inflation gets too hot, when it's above, the 2% level or 2 or 3%, whatever it's going to be, we don't have any ammunition to contain it because we can't afford it, because the short-term pain is too great, because we can't jack up interest rates because we have too much debt. Nobody can afford to service it. Then you have all the defaults, you have all the bankruptcies, you have a collapse, you have a financial crisis. All this stuff is going to happen. And so we have to just let inflation get worse and worse and worse, even as other central banks have the means and the ability to contain their inflation, and we're left to smolder in it on our own. And that's ultimately what precipitates the currency crisis, when people realize the box that the Fed is in, that they're powerless to contain inflation because of the enormity of the debt. And, they've been forced to pick their poison, right, to choose the lesser of what they believe to be the two evils, a complete collapse and deflationary meltdown, or runaway inflation. And they're going to pick inflation every time. They're already laying the foundation for that right now. But I think when people grasp it, the strength that we've been seeing in the U.S. dollar is going to reverse. Now, I believe that the dollar's strength will have already reversed by the time these foreign central banks really start jacking up interest rates, but that will simply accelerate the dollar's decline, and it will ultimately turn into a collapse, putting enormous pressure on the Federal Reserve to ultimately raise interest rates at a time when the economy will be most vulnerable to rising rates, because the Fed would have resisted that so long that the debt bubble would have grown so enormous, as if it's not enormous now, but it'll just get bigger and bigger, that the carnage will be that much more devastating when they're forced to slam on these brakes. We'll be going 100 miles an hour by the time they hit the brakes, as opposed to now maybe it's only 40 miles an hour, whatever the analogy might be. But either way, it's not going to be pretty. when they have to do it. But because they waited so long, it's going to be that much worse.
Today's financial advisors behave like pro wrestling TV commentators. They scream that the recovery is strong, debt is manageable, inflation is low, and that the Federal Reserve has everything under control. They may be oblivious, but the danger is real. Looking beyond the media hype can open a world of broader investing ideas. Euro Pacific Capital is a registered investment advisor that offers stock-focused wealth management services that closely follow the strategy of our founder and CEO, Peter Schiff. We concentrate on those countries that are more closely in tune with Peter's vision of how capitalism is supposed to work. And these investments are not hard to find, provided you know where to look. Isn't it time you change the channel and let Euro Pacific put a little reality back into your portfolio? If you live in the United States and have $25,000 or more to invest, call 800-727-7922. That's 800-727-7922. Non-U.S. residents access similar strategies through Euro Pacific Bank at europacbank.com. Euro Pacific Capital and Euro Pacific Bank are affiliated companies.